A millionaire mocked a humble librarian for her simple appearance. What he later uncovered about her career left him questioning everything. The Lexington Hotel was alive with grandeur. The ballroom sparkled under the glow of ornate chandeliers, casting shimmering patterns across the marble floors. Voices mingled with the soft strains of a live orchestra, a melody so seamless it faded into the background, like the hum of wealth itself. Ethan Cole stood at the heart of it all, the epitome of control. He was a tall man, his tailored midnight blue suit accentuating the sharpness of his physique. His dark hair was perfectly groomed, and his watch, an exclusive custom design, flashed as he raised a glass of champagne to his lips. Conversations around him paused whenever he approached, the magnetic force of his presence undeniable. This was his element, a room full of power players, all vying for his attention or approval. Ethan smirked as he concluded yet another hollow conversation about business expansion. The pleasantries bored him, but he thrived in these settings. Every compliment, every handshake felt like another piece of evidence confirming his superiority. Life was a game, and Ethan played it masterfully. As he surveyed the room, his sharp green eyes caught a figure that seemed out of place. By the hors d'oeuvres table stood a woman in a plain black dress, her brown hair pinned back in an understated style. She wore glasses that framed her almond-shaped eyes, and her posture was relaxed in a way that made her almost invisible. She was small, unimposing, and undeniably ordinary amidst the sea of designer gowns and diamond necklaces. Ethan raised an eyebrow, amused. He took a step toward his friend Mark, who was sipping a martini nearby. "Mark," Ethan said, his voice low and casual. "Who's that? Did someone forget to check the guest list?" Mark followed Ethan's gaze and chuckled lightly. "Ah, I think that's Emily something or other. She runs the library in town, probably here because of that fundraiser your company sponsored. You know how it is, let a few locals in for good PR." Ethan's smirk deepened. A librarian? At an event like this? He didn't try to hide his amusement as he murmured, "Well, someone's a little lost." He started to turn back toward his circle of business acquaintances when the woman moved. She reached for a glass of water from a passing tray, her movements unhurried. Then, without any apparent hesitation, she walked toward him. Ethan froze, caught off guard by the unexpected confidence in her stride. She wasn't smiling, nor was she shrinking. She approached him as if he were any other man in the room. "Good evening," she said, her voice calm but firm. She didn't wait for a response. "You must be Ethan Cole." Ethan tilted his head, intrigued by her directness. "That's right," he said smoothly. "And you are?" "Emily Harper," she replied. She adjusted the strap of her modest purse. "I wanted to thank you for your contribution to the library's literacy program. I'm sure it was a drop in the ocean for someone like you." Her words were polite, but there was an undercurrent of something sharper. Ethan narrowed his eyes, unsure whether to take the comment as a slight or simple honesty. He opted for charm. "Always happy to support the community," he said with a practiced smile. "Though I have to admit, you seem a little out of place here. Not your usual scene, I guess." Emily blinked, unflinching. "You're right. I'm not here for the chandeliers or the champagne. I came because this event is supposed to help real people. People who can't afford tailored suits or diamond cufflinks." She glanced pointedly at his wrist. Ethan's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but he recovered quickly. "Touché," he said, raising his glass in mock salute. "And here I thought librarians were supposed to be meek." Emily's expression didn't change, but something in her gaze seemed to pierce through him. "You think knowing how to read books is meek?" she asked. "That's an interesting perspective for someone whose business depends on contracts written in fine print." Mark, standing just a few feet away, stifled an awkward cough. Ethan's eyes flicked to him briefly, then back to Emily, who remained steady in her stance. "I suppose you have a point," Ethan admitted, forcing a charming grin. "Though I'd argue success isn't written in books. It's created by people who know how to win." Emily tilted her head, considering him carefully. "Winning is subjective, Mr. Cole. What looks like victory to you might be devastation for someone else." The comment lingered in the air longer than Ethan liked. He was used to controlling conversations, steering them where he wanted. But this woman, she wasn't playing along. He felt an unfamiliar twinge of irritation, and perhaps something else, curiosity. "Well," he said, finally breaking the tension with a light chuckle, "I suppose that's one way to look at it. But I've always been more interested in playing the game than analyzing it." Emily nodded slowly. "I'm sure you are," she said. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. Ethan watched her go, his smile fading. He realized the room had grown quieter around him, though the hum of conversation persisted elsewhere. For the first time in a long while, he felt outmaneuvered by a librarian, of all people. Mark leaned closer, a sly grin on his face. "Well, that was unexpected," he murmured. "She's got some nerve, huh?" Ethan didn't respond. His gaze remained on Emily as she moved through the room, speaking briefly with other guests. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. Her manner was too calm, too indifferent. And yet, there was something about her, a quiet authority he couldn't place. Later that evening, as Ethan's car waited outside the hotel's gilded entrance, he caught a glimpse of Emily again. She stepped into the rain with a flimsy umbrella, walking briskly toward the bus stop. No limousine, no driver, just her. He leaned back in his seat, watching her silhouette fade into the distance. Her words echoed in his mind. "Winning is subjective, Mr. Cole." It was absurd, of course. She didn't matter. She was nobody. And yet, as the car pulled away, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just lost something, though he couldn't quite name what it was. What would you have done in Emily's place? Would you have confronted Ethan or let his arrogance slide? Let us know in the comments below. And if you're enjoying the story so far, give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. Ethan Cole rarely thought about anyone outside his tight-knit circle of peers. People who mattered were those who could offer him leverage, align with his ambitions, or prove to be formidable opponents in his relentless climb to the top. Yet, a librarian, a plain woman who wielded words like a scalpel, had somehow slipped into his thoughts. Days after the gala, Ethan found himself absently flipping through paperwork in his sleek Manhattan office. His assistant, Lauren, bustled around, rattling off updates about meetings and acquisitions. But Ethan barely heard her. His mind was stuck on Emily Harper. Not her appearance, which he'd forgotten as quickly as he'd noticed, but the way she had stood her ground. She hadn't fawned, hadn't tried to impress him, two things he took for granted in most encounters. "You're distracted," Lauren said abruptly, her sharp tone cutting through his reverie. She placed a thick folder on his desk and gave him a curious look. "What's on your mind?" "Nothing important," Ethan replied dismissively, leaning back in his chair. He gestured toward the folder. "What's this?" "A potential partnership with Sentinel Publishing," Lauren said. "Their CEO will be in town next week. They're pushing one of the year's biggest bestsellers, and they want to expand their media reach. If we play this right, we could secure the adaptation rights and corner another market." "Bestseller?" Ethan asked, his attention finally snagged. "Who's the author?" Lauren flipped open the folder, revealing a sleek cover with bold, minimalist lettering. Silent Echoes was the title, and the author's name was noticeably absent. Instead, the words anonymous author were printed beneath a glowing review. Anonymous? Ethan scoffed. "That's a gimmick." "Maybe," Lauren said, "but it's working. The book has sold millions of copies in just a few months. Critics are calling it the most poignant social commentary of the decade. If we align with this, it could elevate our brand." Ethan stared at the cover, his competitive instincts kicking in. "Set the meeting," he said. "Let's see what all the fuss is about." Meanwhile, Emily Harper returned to her usual routine, though the memory of the gala lingered faintly. She spent her days in the small-town library, overseeing story time for children, recommending novels to eager readers, and losing herself in the quiet world of books. It was a world she loved, one that required no pretense or games. At night, however, her focus shifted. In the dim light of her modest apartment, she sat at her desk with a pen in hand and pages of handwritten notes scattered around her. Writing was her sanctuary, her way of making sense of the chaos in the world. And while she never sought fame, She knew her words had power. Her book, Silent Echoes, had taken on a life of its own, resonating with readers far beyond her small town. Still, anonymity shielded her from the spotlight. She had no interest in becoming the face of a movement or a household name. She preferred to watch the ripples of her work from a distance, knowing that the people who needed her words most were finding them. That evening, as she organized her drafts, her phone buzzed with a message from her publisher. It was a reminder of the Sentinel Publishing meeting scheduled for next week. They wanted to discuss media rights and merchandising, a prospect that made Emily uncomfortable. She wasn't interested in commercializing her work. She only agreed to attend the meeting because her publisher insisted it was important. Emily sighed, setting the phone aside. She didn't belong in corporate boardrooms or luxury suites, but she also knew her work was bigger than her discomfort. If it meant ensuring her message reached the right people, she would face whatever came next. The following week, Ethan arrived at the Sentinel Publishing meeting with his usual air of authority. His team flanked him, all sharply dressed and armed with polished presentations. The conference room was a pristine space, filled with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. It was a room meant to intimidate. But when the meeting began, Ethan found himself unexpectedly intrigued. The discussion revolved around the impact of Silent Echoes, its themes of resilience, community, and the cost of unchecked ambition. The book was deeply critical of the very systems Ethan had built his empire upon, though he didn't see it that way at first. "I want to meet the author," Ethan said suddenly, interrupting the flow of the meeting. His voice carried a finality that silenced the room. The Sentinel representatives exchanged hesitant glances. "The author prefers to remain anonymous," one of them explained. "They've made it clear that their identity isn't part of the brand." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Everyone has a price," he said coolly. "I'm sure they'll reconsider when the right offer is on the table." The room fell silent again, but the tension lingered. It was clear that Ethan wasn't used to hearing no. Emily, oblivious to the storm brewing in the corporate world, spent that same afternoon hosting a community event at the library. The small room was packed with locals, young and old, gathered to discuss the importance of preserving public spaces. Emily spoke passionately, her love for the library shining through in every word. She didn't just see the library as a building filled with books. It was a haven, a place where people could find themselves, learn, and grow. After the event, a young girl approached Emily, clutching a tattered copy of Silent Echoes. "This book made me want to write my own stories," the girl said shyly. "Thank you for making it." Emily smiled, her heart swelling with quiet pride. "I'm glad it spoke to you," she said. "Keep writing. Your words matter more than you know." Back in Manhattan, Ethan's curiosity about the mysterious author grew. He ordered a copy of Silent Echoes that evening, his mind restless. As he flipped through the pages late into the night, he found himself drawn into its world. The writing was sharp, unflinching, and hauntingly familiar. The book's depiction of greed and exploitation hit closer to home than he cared to admit. By the time he finished the final chapter, the sun was rising, and Ethan was no longer the same man who had opened the book. He didn't want to admit it, but the words had struck a nerve. He felt seen, even exposed, as if the author had peered into his life and laid bare his flaws. Ethan's thoughts turned to the anonymous writer. Who were they? And why did their words feel so personal? He couldn't shake the need to find out. The library was a world apart from the grandeur Ethan Cole was accustomed to. Its charm lay in its simplicity. Rows of well-worn bookshelves, the scent of old pages mingling with fresh coffee from a nearby cart, and soft whispers of patrons flipping through stories. It was the kind of place Ethan would normally dismiss as inconsequential. Yet, here he was, stepping through the heavy oak doors with a purpose that even he couldn't fully explain. Lauren had given him the name of a rare manuscript that could strengthen one of his company's upcoming deals. It wasn't the sort of errand he usually handled personally, but something had compelled him to leave his office and make the trip himself. Maybe it was a flicker of curiosity, or maybe it was the lingering unease after finishing Silent Echoes. Whatever the reason, Ethan found himself standing awkwardly at the front desk, waiting for assistance. The library was quiet, save for the rustle of pages and the occasional murmur of a child. As Ethan scanned the room, his gaze landed on a familiar figure, Emily Harper. She was shelving books at the far end of the room, her movements efficient and unhurried. She wore a simple cardigan over a plain blouse, and her hair was tied back in a loose bun. There was nothing remarkable about her appearance, yet something about her presence felt grounded, as if she belonged in a way Ethan never could. She hadn't noticed him yet, and for a brief moment, Ethan considered leaving before she did. But pride held him in place. He was Ethan Cole. He didn't hide from anyone, least of all a small-town librarian who thought she could outwit him. When Emily finally turned, her eyes widened slightly in recognition, but her expression quickly settled into polite indifference. She approached the desk, her tone professional. "Mr. Cole," she said evenly, "to what do we owe the honor?" Ethan's smirk returned, though it lacked its usual sharpness. "I'm looking for a manuscript," he said, sliding a note across the desk with the title scrawled in his assistant's handwriting. "Apparently, it's only available here." Emily took the note and glanced at it, her eyebrows lifting slightly. "Ah, yes. It's part of our archival collection. Very rare." She paused, her gaze flickering back to him. "And very delicate. We don't typically allow it to leave the premises." Ethan chuckled, leaning against the counter. "I'm sure an exception can be made. Library policies aren't negotiable," Emily replied smoothly, her tone calm but firm. Ethan tilted his head, studying her. "You do realize who I am, don't you?" Emily met his gaze without flinching. "I do. And that's precisely why the policy remains in place. Rules shouldn't change just because someone with a big bank account walks in." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Ethan was used to getting his way with minimal effort, yet Emily seemed immune to his charm, or his power. It was both infuriating and, he had to admit, intriguing. "Fine," he said at last, his voice carrying a note of resignation. "I'll read it here. Lead the way." Emily gave a small nod and motioned for him to follow. As they walked through the aisles, Ethan couldn't help but notice how at ease she seemed in her surroundings. She moved with a quiet confidence, her fingers occasionally brushing the spines of books as if greeting old friends. In contrast, Ethan felt distinctly out of place, his polished shoes clicking too loudly against the wooden floor. They arrived at a small reading room tucked away at the back of the library. Emily retrieved the manuscript from a locked cabinet, handling it with care as she placed it on the table. "Here it is," she said, stepping back. "I'll leave you to it." Ethan glanced at her. "You're not staying to supervise?" Emily folded her arms. "I trust you can handle it. Just don't spill coffee on it, or use it as leverage in one of your business deals." Her comment was laced with subtle sarcasm, and Ethan couldn't suppress a grin. "Noted," he said, settling into the chair. As Emily walked away, Ethan opened the manuscript and began to read, but his focus wavered. The words on the page blurred as his thoughts drifted back to her. She was unlike anyone he'd ever encountered, unimpressed by his wealth, unintimidated by his presence. It was maddening and, at the same time, strangely refreshing. Hours later, as the library prepared to close, Emily approached the reading room to find Ethan still engrossed in the manuscript. His suit jacket was draped over the back of the chair, his tie loosened. He looked almost normal. The thought startled her. "It's closing time," she said, stepping into the room. Ethan looked up, blinking as if he'd been pulled from another world. He glanced at his watch and frowned. "I didn't realize I'd been here so long." Emily gestured toward the manuscript. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Ethan hesitated before nodding. "Yes. It's an impressive collection." She studied him for a moment, then leaned against the doorway. "You don't strike me as someone who spends much time in libraries." "I don't," he admitted, his tone almost rueful. "But maybe I should." Emily raised an eyebrow. "And why's that?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Let's just say I've been reminded that there's more to the world than boardrooms and bottom lines." Her expression softened slightly, though she didn't let him off the hook entirely. "Well, don't let the library become your next acquisition." Ethan chuckled, standing and slipping into his jacket. "I'll try to resist." As he prepared to leave, he hesitated, turning back to her. "Emily," he said, her name unfamiliar on his tongue. "You're not what I expected." She tilted her head. "And what did you expect?" Ethan shrugged, his smirk returning. "I'm still figuring that out." With that, he left, the echo of his footsteps fading into the quiet evening. Emily watched him go, her thoughts swirling. She hadn't intended to cross paths with Ethan Cole again, much less engage with him. Yet, something about their encounters left her unsettled, like a puzzle with pieces just out of reach. Neither of them realized it, but their lives were already beginning to intertwine in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. Ethan Cole sat in his corner office, high above the chaotic streets of Manhattan, with the skyline stretching endlessly beyond the glass walls. Despite the grandeur surrounding him, his attention was locked on a slim, unassuming book resting on his desk, Silent Echoes. Its plain cover betrayed none of the power within, yet Ethan couldn't shake the unsettling effect it had on him. Lauren entered, clipboard in hand, breaking his thoughts. "Ethan, the numbers are in. Silent Echoes isn't just holding steady, it's exploding. Global sales hit 20 million copies, and the buzz on social media is astronomical. Sentinel Publishing wants to ramp up their media strategy with your help." Ethan looked up, his green eyes narrowing slightly. "Still no word on the author?" "Nothing," Lauren replied, exasperated. "They're a ghost. Sentinel swears they don't even know their identity." "Convenient," Ethan muttered. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "This book, it's hitting nerves. Not just with readers, but with me. There's something in it personal, almost deliberate." Lauren raised an eyebrow. "Deliberate? That's a stretch, don't you think?" "Maybe," Ethan admitted. "But I can't shake the feeling." His instincts, honed from years of deal-making and manipulation, told him there was more to Silent Echoes than a compelling narrative. The book's themes of unchecked ambition, the cost of greed, and the destruction of small communities felt like accusations aimed directly at his world. Lauren hesitated, then said, "If you're that curious, why not make the author's identity part of the deal? Sentinel wants this partnership badly enough." Ethan smirked. "Now you're thinking like me." He tapped the book's cover, his mind already calculating. Set the meeting. Across town, Emily Harper sat in the small reading nook of her apartment, sipping a cup of tea as she sifted through emails from her publisher. The constant stream of accolades for Silent Echoes should have felt satisfying, but instead, it left her uneasy. The world's fascination with her words was growing, and with it, the pressure to step into the spotlight she so desperately avoided. Her publisher's latest email was a blunt request. "Sentinel wants to escalate media opportunities, including interviews and possibly revealing your identity. Please consider," Emily sighed, running a hand through her hair. She had always written to express, not to expose. Her anonymity wasn't a gimmick. It was her armor. Yet, as she glanced at the stack of letters from readers she had collected over the months, she felt the weight of responsibility. Her words had touched lives. Could she step forward to protect them without losing herself in the process? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Davis, her elderly neighbor, holding a pie. Emily smiled warmly and invited her in, grateful for the distraction. They chatted about small-town life, the weather, and Mrs. Davis's grandchildren, a conversation steeped in simplicity. It reminded Emily why she stayed in this quiet town, away from the noise of big cities and corporate boardrooms. After Mrs. Davis left, Emily returned to her desk. She opened a fresh notebook, her hand hovering over the first blank page. Writing had always been her solace, but tonight, her thoughts felt scattered. She couldn't shake the sense that her carefully constructed life was on the verge of collision with a world she had long avoided. The day of the Sentinel Publishing meeting arrived, and Ethan was dressed for war. His navy suit was impeccably tailored, his watch gleaming under the conference room lights as he entered the room with his team. Representatives from Sentinel greeted him with eager smiles, their excitement palpable. This partnership could solidify their dominance in the media space, and Ethan Cole was the man to make it happen. The discussion began smoothly. Marketing strategies, global reach, and potential adaptations for Silent Echoes were laid out in detail. Ethan listened with half an ear, his mind preoccupied with the author. When the time came for questions, he leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "Let's talk about the author," he said. The room quieted. "If this partnership is going to work, I need to know who they are." The Sentinel executives exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, one of them said, "The author's anonymity is non-negotiable. It's part of the book's mystique." Ethan's smile didn't reach his eyes. Mystique doesn't sell movies or merchandise. "If this partnership is going to work, I need direct access to the source." There was a tense pause before the executive relented. "We'll see what we can do." Ethan nodded, satisfied. He wasn't accustomed to hearing no, and he didn't intend to start now. While Ethan plotted his next move, Emily prepared for her own meeting with Sentinel. She arrived at their headquarters wearing a simple blouse and slacks, her nerves carefully masked by a composed demeanor. Her publisher greeted her warmly, ushering her into a private conference room. The executives were polite, even deferential, as they outlined their plans for expanding Silent Echoes into other media. Emily listened patiently, but her unease grew with every slide. The commercialization of her work felt like a betrayal of its purpose. "We'd also like to discuss a potential public appearance," one of them said. "Readers are desperate to know the mind behind the words." Emily hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "I appreciate the enthusiasm," she said carefully, "but my identity isn't relevant to the book's message. The words should stand on their own." Her publisher stepped in, smoothing the conversation with reassurances, but Emily knew the pressure wasn't going to stop. She left the meeting feeling like a thread pulled taut, one sharp tug away from unraveling. As she walked toward the elevator, her phone buzzed. It was a notification about Ethan Cole. The headline read, "Media Mogul Partners with Sentinel for Landmark Deal." Emily's stomach tightened. She hadn't expected her path to cross with his again, but now it seemed inevitable. Later that night, Ethan found himself in his penthouse, staring out at the glittering city below. He held a glass of whiskey, the weight of the day pressing on him. Something about Silent Echoes continued to gnaw at him. The anonymity of the author felt deliberate, almost taunting, as if they were hiding not just from the world, but from him specifically. His thoughts wandered back to Emily Harper. Her sharp wit and unshakable presence had lingered in his mind far longer than he cared to admit. There was a simplicity to her that contrasted starkly with his world of excess and ambition. Yet, for all her modesty, she had a strength that unnerved him. Ethan set the glass down and picked up the book again, flipping to a passage he had dog-eared. The words leapt off the page, a mirror to his own life. "In the relentless pursuit of power, we lose sight of the quiet voices, the ones we dismiss as irrelevant until they're the only ones left to hear." The room felt colder as he closed the book. He didn't like what it reflected, but he couldn't look away. Ethan Cole had never been one to fixate on mysteries. In his world, problems were meant to be solved, challenges were meant to be conquered, and secrets were meant to be uncovered, preferably on his terms. Yet, the enigma surrounding the author of Silent Echoes was gnawing at him, a quiet but relentless presence in his thoughts. Sitting in his penthouse office, Ethan stared out at the city skyline. His team had compiled reports, made calls, and even hired private investigators, but every trail led to a dead end. The author had gone to extraordinary lengths to remain anonymous. For most, this would have been a minor inconvenience, but for Ethan, it was personal. The book wasn't just a literary phenomenon. It felt like an indictment of the very empire he had built. He closed the report on his desk and leaned back in his chair. Across from him, Lauren was reviewing a stack of files, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Any luck?" he asked, his tone edged with impatience. Lauren looked up and shook her head. "No one seems to know anything. Whoever they are, they're good at staying hidden." Ethan drummed his fingers on the desk. "It doesn't add up. Someone wrote this. Someone with a clear understanding of what it's like to be at the top. The insight, the criticism. It's too precise." Lauren hesitated, then said carefully, "Maybe that's why they're staying anonymous. If the book feels personal to you, imagine how it must feel to everyone else in power. Exposing themselves could put them at risk." Ethan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he picked up the book again, flipping to a passage he had marked. The words leapt off the page, as biting as the first time he read them. Empires crumble not because of external threats, but because of the rot within: arrogance, greed, and the belief that success justifies all. He closed the book abruptly. "I want more than speculation, Lauren. Keep digging." Lauren nodded, though her expression betrayed doubt. She had worked with Ethan long enough to know that when he fixated on something, he wouldn't let it go. Still, she couldn't help but wonder if this particular obsession was leading him somewhere he wasn't prepared to go. Meanwhile, in the quiet town library, Emily Harper went about her day with practiced ease. The library had become busier in recent weeks, thanks to a local reading initiative she had championed. Parents brought their children for story time, students filled the study tables, and retirees lingered in the cozy reading corners. It was a vibrant, living space, exactly how Emily had always envisioned it. Yet, beneath her composed exterior, Emily was grappling with the growing attention on her book. She had managed to maintain her anonymity thus far, but the demands of the publishing world were becoming harder to ignore. Sentinel Publishing had sent another email that morning, urging her to consider media appearances. Emily sighed as she shelved a stack of books. The thought of stepping into the spotlight filled her with dread. Her words were meant to stand on their own, unclouded by the distraction of her identity. And yet, she knew that staying in the shadows wouldn't be sustainable forever. "Emily," a voice called, pulling her from her thoughts. She turned to see Mr. Grayson, a retired teacher who was one of the library's most loyal patrons. "Good afternoon, Mr. Grayson," she said, offering a warm smile. "How can I help you today?" He held up a copy of Silent Echoes. "This book," he said, shaking it gently, "it's extraordinary. It's like the author knew exactly what I needed to hear. Do you know anything about them? I'd love to write them a letter." Emily's smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. "I've heard the author prefers to remain anonymous," she said, "but I'm glad the book resonated with you." Mr. Grayson nodded, his expression thoughtful. Resonated is an understatement. It feels like they've seen the world as it truly is, beautiful and broken all at once. Whoever they are, I hope they know how much their words matter. Emily thanked him and watched as he returned to his usual corner. His words lingered in her mind, a bittersweet reminder of why she had written the book in the first place. She wanted to make people feel seen, to give voice to the quiet struggles and triumphs that often went unnoticed. But could she keep doing that from behind a veil of anonymity? Ethan's curiosity continued to grow, consuming more of his thoughts than he cared to admit. He began rereading Silent Echoes, this time taking notes on the passages that struck him most. There was something intimate about the writing, as if the author had lived every word they penned. It wasn't just a story, it was a reflection, a challenge, and, in some ways, a warning. One evening, as Ethan sat in his private library, a thought struck him. The language in the book, the tone. It reminded him of someone. His mind flashed to Emily Harper and their brief but memorable encounters. Her sharp wit, her unflinching gaze, the way she spoke with a quiet authority. Could it be her? The idea seemed absurd at first. Emily was a small-town librarian, not a literary sensation. But the more Ethan thought about it, the more the pieces began to align. Her disdain for greed, her passion for community, her ability to see through him so effortlessly. It all matched the voice in Silent Echoes. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. If Emily Harper was the author, she had been hiding in plain sight. And if she was the author, then she had written this book with a purpose that might include him. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the library unannounced. He walked through the familiar oak doors, his polished shoes striking the floor with confidence. Emily was at the front desk, helping a young boy find a book. When she looked up and saw him, her expression shifted from surprise to wary neutrality. "Mr. Cole," she said, her tone even. "Back so soon? Didn't think the library would be your kind of place." Ethan approached the desk, his gaze sharp. "You'd be surprised," he said. "I've been thinking a lot about words lately, about their power, how they can build or destroy." Emily raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. "I read Silent Echoes again," Ethan continued, watching her closely, "and I couldn't help but wonder about the author. Their voice, it feels familiar." Emily's hand stilled on the desk, but her expression remained calm. Does it? Ethan leaned in slightly, his voice dropping. Is there something you're not telling me, Miss Harper? For a moment, Emily held his gaze, her eyes unreadable. Then she straightened, her tone brisk. If you're here for books, Mr. Cole, I'm happy to help. If you're here to make accusations, you're wasting your time. Ethan smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. Fair enough, he said. But I'll find out sooner or later. As he turned to leave, Emily exhaled softly, her grip on the desk tightening. She had always known the truth would come to light eventually. But now, with Ethan Cole closing in, she realized just how high the stakes had become. Ethan Cole prided himself on his ability to see through people, to uncover motives hidden beneath layers of pretense. It was a skill that had propelled him to the top of the business world. Yet, for all his acumen, the puzzle of silent echoes remained maddeningly out of reach, until now. Emily Harper. Her name echoed in his mind as he sat in his penthouse office, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. It had been weeks since his last visit to the library, but he couldn't shake the memory of her sharp eyes, her steady tone, and the way she seemed to exist outside his sphere of influence. The idea that she might be the anonymous author was growing harder to dismiss. Ethan leaned forward, pulling the book closer. He flipped through its pages, his fingers brushing over the words that had struck him the hardest. If Emily was behind this, then she wasn't just a librarian. She was a force, a quiet, unassuming force that had shaken the very foundation of his empire. He needed proof. Emily Harper had always known that anonymity was a fragile thing. For months, she had walked the line between privacy and exposure, careful not to leave any breadcrumbs that might lead back to her. But even the best-laid plans had cracks, and she felt them widening now. She sat at her desk in the library, her hands resting on a stack of returned books. The room was bustling with activity. Students hunched over laptops, children laughing softly in the reading corner. But her focus was elsewhere. Ethan Cole's visit had unsettled her. She had seen the flicker of recognition in his eyes, the unspoken question hanging between them. He was too perceptive to ignore the similarities between her and the author's voice. Emily. A voice broke through her thoughts. It was Diane, her colleague and closest confidant at the library. You've been staring at those books for 10 minutes. What's on your mind? Emily offered a faint smile. Nothing important. Diane raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. You've been nothing important, Angie, a lot lately. Come on, spill. Emily hesitated, then sighed. Do you ever feel like your past is catching up to you? Diane frowned, leaning against the counter. What do you mean? Before Emily could answer, the library's doors swung open and a familiar figure strode in. Ethan Cole. His presence was like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the room. Conversations quieted, heads turned, and even Emily felt the shift in the air. Diane straightened. Isn't that? Yes, Emily said, cutting her off. I'll handle it. Ethan approached the desk with the same confidence he carried into every room, though his expression was less polished than usual. There was something raw in his eyes, something almost unsettled. Miss Harper, he greeted her, his tone measured. We need to talk. Emily set down the books, her demeanor cool. If you're here to check out something, you're welcome to browse. If not, I'm not sure what we have to discuss. Ethan's lips twitched into a faint smirk. You're good at deflecting. I'll give you that. But I think we both know why I'm here. Emily folded her arms, meeting his gaze head-on. Enlighten me. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a copy of Silent Echoes. The sight of it made her stomach tighten, though she kept her expression neutral. This book, Ethan said, placing it on the counter between them, has been on my mind for weeks. The voice, the tone, it's familiar. Too familiar. Emily's heart raced, but her voice remained steady. You think I wrote it? Ethan tilted his head. Did you? For a moment, the library seemed to hold its breath. Emily's fingers brushed the edge of the book, her thoughts swirling. Denial would be the easiest path, but it would only delay the inevitable. Ethan Cole was not a man who gave up easily. Finally, she exhaled softly. What if I did? Ethan straightened, his expression shifting from curiosity to something more intense. Triumph, perhaps, or vindication. Then I'd say you've been hiding more than just your talent. Emily's jaw tightened. I've been protecting my work. Something you wouldn't understand. Try me, Ethan said, his voice low. The tension between them crackled, unspoken truths hovering in the space they shared. Emily took a step back, crossing her arms over her chest. You think you've uncovered some great secret, Mr. Cole, but the truth is, this isn't about you. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Isn't it? The book is practically a mirror to my world. The greed, the ambition. It's all there. It's there because it's everywhere, Emily shot back. Your world is just one example. Their voices had risen slightly, drawing a few curious glances from nearby patrons. Emily glanced around, her cheeks flushing. She lowered her voice. This isn't the place for this conversation. Ethan nodded, gesturing toward the door. Then let's go. Emily hesitated, then grabbed her coat. She led him out of the library and into the crisp autumn air. They walked in silence for a few blocks until they reached a quiet park. The trees were shedding their golden leaves, and the air smelled of earth and approaching rain. So, Ethan said, breaking the silence, how does a librarian write a bestseller that dismantles everything people like me stand for? Emily turned to face him, her expression resolute. By paying attention. By listening to the people your world forgets. By understanding what it's like to be dismissed, ignored, and stepped over. Her words hit harder than Ethan expected. He shoved his hands into his pockets, looking away. And you think writing a book changes any of that? It already has, Emily replied. People are talking. They're thinking. That's more than I could have hoped for. Ethan was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the ground. Then he looked at her, something raw and vulnerable in his expression. Why didn't you just come forward? You could have had fame, influence, power. Emily shook her head. I don't want power, Mr. Cole. I want impact. And staying anonymous allowed me to focus on the work, not the noise. Ethan studied her, the weight of her words settling over him. For the first time in years, he felt stripped bare. Not by force, but by the truth she carried so effortlessly. You've made your point, he said finally, his voice softer. But I can't ignore the fact that this book, it's changed the way I see things. Emily's expression softened, though her guard remained up. Then maybe it's done its job. As they stood there in the quiet park, the distance between them felt both vast and fragile. Ethan knew this wasn't the end of their story, far from it. But for now, he was left with the uncomfortable realization that Emily Harper wasn't just a librarian or an author. She was something he couldn't quite define, and someone he couldn't ignore. Ethan Cole was a man who lived by control. Every deal, every meeting, every handshake. His success was a carefully constructed empire, brick by calculated brick. Yet, standing in the quiet of his penthouse, staring at silent echoes on the coffee table, he felt that control slipping away. Emily Harper's admission had left him reeling. She wasn't just the author. She was a mirror he didn't want to face. The book wasn't an abstract criticism of greed and ambition. It was a scalpel dissecting the very principles he had built his life around. And worse, she had written it knowing exactly who he was, challenging him without ever saying his name. Ethan poured himself a drink, the amber liquid swirling in the crystal glass. He was accustomed to being the smartest person in the room, but Emily had blindsided him. The woman he had dismissed at the gala, mocked as irrelevant, had quietly shaped a narrative powerful enough to alter the public's perception and his own. For the first time in years, Ethan wasn't sure of his next move. Across town, Emily Harper sat in her modest apartment, reviewing her publisher's latest email. Sentinel was pushing harder than ever for her to step into the spotlight. They wanted interviews, public readings, and even a documentary. Emily had resisted thus far, but the pressure was mounting. The book's success had snowballed into something far larger than she had anticipated. She closed her laptop and leaned back, her mind wandering to her conversation with Ethan. Despite her efforts to avoid him, he had found her, forcing her to confront the very thing she had tried to keep separate, her identity as the author. And now, he knew the truth. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from her publisher. Sentinel has scheduled a press conference for next week. We need your decision. Emily sighed, setting the phone down. The walls she had built around herself were beginning to crumble, and she wasn't sure she had the strength to hold them up. The next morning, Ethan arrived at his office earlier than usual. He bypassed his assistant's desk without a word, heading straight for the conference room where his executive team was already waiting. Sentinel's representatives had joined the meeting, their excitement palpable as they presented their latest projections for Silent Echoes. The book is a phenomenon, one of them said, his voice brimming with enthusiasm. The next step is to secure the author's involvement. We believe a public reveal could triple sales overnight. Ethan listened silently, his gaze fixed on the charts and graphs projected on the screen. When the presentation ended, he leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. And if the author refuses, he asked. The room fell silent. Sentinel's lead representative cleared his throat. We've made it clear how much is at stake. But we're optimistic they'll see reason. Ethan's jaw tightened. He thought of Emily, her quiet resolve, her refusal to be swayed by money or influence. She wasn't the kind of person who could be coerced, and he found himself strangely reluctant to see her forced into the spotlight. Let me handle it, Ethan said finally, his tone leaving no room for argument. I'll speak to the author directly. The Sentinel team exchanged uncertain glances, but ultimately nodded. Ethan's reputation as a closer was legendary, and they were willing to defer to his judgment. Later that afternoon, Ethan found himself back at the library. The familiar oak doors felt less imposing this time, though he couldn't shake the tension coiled in his chest. He spotted Emily at the far end of the room, engrossed in conversation with a young boy who was holding a stack of books nearly as tall as he was. Ethan waited until she was alone before approaching. She glanced up as he neared, her expression wary but not entirely surprised. Mr. Cole, she said, her tone neutral. Back again? Ethan offered a faint smile. It seems I can't stay away. Emily arched an eyebrow but said nothing. She gestured for him to follow her to a quieter corner of the library, away from the patrons. Once they were seated, she folded her hands on the table, waiting for him to speak. I won't waste your time, Ethan began. Sentinel is pushing hard for a public reveal. They think it's the only way to capitalize on the book's success. Emily's eyes narrowed. And you're here to convince me to comply? No, Ethan said, surprising even himself. I'm here to understand. Emily studied him for a moment, her gaze searching. Understand what? Why you're so determined to stay in the shadows, he said. This book, it's bigger than you or me. You've started something that could change the way people think about power, greed, and the systems we take for granted. But you can't do that from the sidelines. Emily leaned back, her expression thoughtful. I didn't write the book to be a hero, Mr. Cole. I wrote it to make people think. And they are, without knowing who I am. But imagine what more you could do, Ethan pressed. Your voice could carry even further. Emily shook her head. You don't get it. The moment I step into the spotlight, the focus shifts from the message to the messenger. People will care more about who I am than what I've said. Ethan was silent, her words resonating in a way he hadn't anticipated. He had spent his entire life chasing visibility, believing it to be the ultimate measure of success. Yet here was Emily, deliberately rejecting it, and somehow wielding more influence than he ever had. You're not wrong, he admitted. But the world doesn't change without sacrifice. Emily's expression softened slightly, though her guard remained up. And what are you willing to sacrifice, Mr. Cole? Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the question. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time, he realized he didn't have an answer. The days that followed were a whirlwind of decisions and consequences. Sentinel continued to push for Emily's reveal, but Ethan found himself stepping in to shield her from their more aggressive tactics. He didn't fully understand why. Perhaps it was guilt or respect or something he wasn't ready to name. But he knew he couldn't let her be dragged into the chaos against her will. At the same time, Ethan began to take a closer look at his own empire. He attended meetings with a new perspective, questioning decisions he once made without hesitation. He found himself thinking about the people affected by his deals, the ones Emily's book had forced him to see. One evening, as he stood on the balcony of his penthouse, overlooking the city lights, he made a decision. He couldn't undo the past, but he could reshape the future. And it started with owning the mistakes he had ignored for too long. Emily, too, was undergoing a transformation. Though she remained firm in her desire to stay anonymous, she began to see Ethan in a different light. He wasn't just the arrogant mogul she had written about. He was a man grappling with the weight of his own choices. And while she didn't trust him completely, she couldn't deny that he was trying. Their paths, once oppositional, were beginning to align in ways neither of them had expected. The conference room at Sentinel Publishing was a buzz of activity. Executives, marketers, and media strategists huddled around glowing screens, plotting the next phase of Silent Echoes. Despite the energy, one seat at the table remained conspicuously empty. Emily Harper, the voice behind the book that had captivated the world, was absent. Ethan Cole sat at the head of the table, his gaze sharp and unyielding. He had orchestrated this meeting, but his thoughts were miles away. Emily's words from their last conversation echoed in his mind. The moment I step into the spotlight, the message is lost. He had spent weeks trying to reconcile her perspective with the demands of an industry that thrived on exposure. When the room finally quieted, Ethan cleared his throat. "Let's get started," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I've spoken with the author. While they're committed to the book's message, they've made it clear they won't be stepping forward publicly." A murmur of disappointment rippled through the room. One of Sentinel's executives, a polished man in his mid-50s, leaned forward. "With all due respect, Mr. Cole, we need the author's presence to push this to the next level. The book has potential to become a global movement, but only if we have a face to attach to it." Ethan's jaw tightened. He had anticipated this resistance. "The author's identity is irrelevant," he said firmly. "The book is the movement. Our job is to amplify its voice, not distract from it." The executive hesitated, then leaned back in his chair. "If that's the decision, we'll adjust accordingly. But I hope the author understands what they're giving up." Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line. "They understand perfectly." Meanwhile, Emily Harper stood in the quiet of her library, watching the afternoon light filter through the tall windows. Her decision not to reveal herself had been reaffirmed after Ethan's visit, but it didn't make the choice any easier. She felt the weight of expectations pressing down on her, the tension between staying true to her values and seizing an opportunity to expand her message. As she shelved books, the sound of the library doors opening drew her attention. She turned to see Ethan entering, his polished shoes clicking softly against the floor. He carried a worn copy of Silent Echoes under one arm, a stark contrast to his usual immaculate appearance. "Mr. Cole," she said, setting down the stack of books in her hands. "What brings you back?" Ethan approached the desk, his expression unreadable. "I wanted to tell you in person." Sentinel agreed to proceed without a public reveal. Emily blinked, surprised. "They agreed? They weren't happy about it," Ethan admitted. "But I made it clear that the decision wasn't negotiable." Emily studied him, her surprise giving way to cautious gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. "I know that wasn't easy." Ethan shrugged, though his tone was serious. "It's your choice. I wasn't going to let them take that from you." The silence that followed was heavy but not uncomfortable. For the first time, Emily saw a side of Ethan she hadn't expected, a man willing to set aside his own ambitions to respect someone else's boundaries. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was a start. In the weeks that followed, Ethan threw himself into the project with a determination that surprised even his closest colleagues. He pushed Sentinel to focus on grassroots campaigns, ensuring the book reached schools, libraries, and underserved communities. His name remained in the background, his usual hunger for credit replaced by a quiet resolve to do something meaningful. Emily, too, found herself drawn into the evolving movement. She began hosting discussions at the library, creating spaces for readers to explore the book's themes and connect them to their own lives. Though she stayed out of the media frenzy, her impact was undeniable. She saw it in the letters from readers, in the crowded events, and in the conversations sparked by her words. One evening, as she prepared to close the library, she noticed a familiar figure lingering by the shelves. Ethan stood in the fiction section, his attention fixed on a row of books. He didn't notice her approach until she was only a few feet away. "Looking for something?" Emily asked, her tone light. Ethan turned, a rare smile crossing his face. "Maybe. Thought I'd see what you recommend." Emily chuckled, pulling a book from the shelf. "Here," she said, handing it to him. "A classic. Might do you some good." Ethan glanced at the cover, To Kill a Mockingbird, and raised an eyebrow. "Subtle." "It's never too late to learn," Emily replied, her eyes sparkling with quiet amusement. He tucked the book under his arm, his expression softening. "I've been meaning to thank you." "For what?" Emily asked, genuinely curious. "For not holding back," Ethan said. "For making me see things I didn't want to see." Emily tilted her head, considering him. "And what do you see now?" Ethan's gaze met hers, steady and unguarded. "That I have a lot to learn." As the months passed, the unlikely partnership between Ethan and Emily deepened. They worked together to expand the book's reach, their once oppositional dynamic evolving into something built on mutual respect. Emily's influence softened Ethan's edges, while Ethan's resources amplified Emily's message. One night, as they sat on a park bench after a long day of meetings, Ethan turned to Emily. "You've changed me," he said quietly, "whether you believe it or not." Emily smiled faintly. "People don't change, Mr. Cole. They grow, and growth takes time." Ethan nodded, her words settling over him like a challenge. For the first time, he felt ready to meet it. The Sentinel Publishing Gala was a spectacle of opulence and influence, the kind of event that Ethan Cole once thrived on. Glittering chandeliers reflected in the polished marble floors, and the hum of conversation intermingled with the clinking of glasses. It was a celebration of silent echoes, the book that had shaken industries and sparked debates, transforming itself into a cultural phenomenon. Yet, for all the grandeur, Ethan felt an unsettling hollowness. The banner dominating the room bore only the book's title, stark and mysterious as ever. Beneath it, journalists and executives mingled, discussing its runaway success and speculating about the identity of its elusive author. Ethan, now the unofficial face of the book's movement, moved through the crowd with practiced ease, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He scanned the room until his gaze settled on her. Emily Harper, tucked away near a corner table stacked with first editions of Silent Echoes. She was talking with a young girl no older than 10, her small hands clutching a dog-eared copy of the book. Emily crouched to the girl's level, her expression gentle and attentive as they spoke. The girl's face lit up, and she hugged the book tightly to her chest. Ethan stayed back, watching as the girl's parents approached, thanking Emily before they left. Emily straightened, brushing a strand of hair from her face. For a fleeting moment, she looked overwhelmed, as if the weight of her words and the movement they had inspired were catching up to her. Ethan approached her cautiously. She noticed him before he could speak, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Mr. Cole," she said evenly, "I see you've mastered the art of blending in." He smiled faintly, glancing around the room. "I'd say the same for you, but I'm not sure hiding in the shadows counts as blending in." Emily crossed her arms, tilting her head. "I'm here for the cause, not the spectacle." "And yet," Ethan said, stepping closer, "you're part of the reason this spectacle exists." Emily sighed, her gaze softening but still wary. "What do you want, Ethan?" He hesitated, caught off guard by the way she said his name. It lacked the sarcasm or judgment he had grown used to, and something about it disarmed him. "To say thank you," he said simply. Emily raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For not giving up," he replied. "On your message, on what this book means. And maybe, for not giving up on me either." Her expression shifted, surprise flickering across her face before she quickly masked it. "I didn't write this book for you, Ethan." "I know," he said quietly, "but it still changed me." Before Emily could respond, a sleek woman in a glittering gown approached them, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Cole," she said, glancing between him and Emily, "we're about to begin the presentation. You're needed on stage." Ethan nodded, though his attention remained on Emily. Are you ready for this? Emily glanced toward the stage, where a podium waited beneath the massive banner. The weight of the evening pressed down on her, but she nodded. Let's get it over with. The applause was deafening as Ethan took the stage. The audience of journalists, executives, and cultural influencers waited eagerly for his speech, cameras flashing and pens poised. Ethan was used to this, but tonight felt different. He wasn't here to promote a new deal or flaunt his success. He was here because of silent echoes. Good evening, he began, his voice steady. We're here tonight to celebrate more than just a book. We're here to celebrate an idea, a call to reflect on the systems we build, the choices we make, and the impact we leave behind. The crowd listened intently as Ethan spoke, his words carefully crafted but sincere. He praised the book's ability to provoke thought and challenge norms, emphasizing its relevance in a world often consumed by ambition and greed. And of course, he concluded, none of this would be possible without the brilliant mind behind Silent Echoes. While the author chooses to remain anonymous, their voice is loud and clear in every page of this extraordinary work. The applause was thunderous as Ethan stepped back, motioning for Emily to join him. She hesitated briefly before ascending the steps, her posture straight but her hands betraying a hint of nervousness. The room quieted as she approached the podium. Emily gripped the edges of the podium, her knuckles white. She scanned the crowd, her heart pounding, but when she finally spoke, her voice was steady. When I wrote Silent Echoes, she began, I didn't expect it to leave my small apartment. It wasn't written for recognition or fame. It was written as a reflection, a way to explore the questions that haunt us all. What kind of world are we building? Who gets left behind in the process? And what does it cost us to win? She paused, her eyes sweeping the room. This book isn't about me. It's about us. It's about the power of choice. The choice to see beyond our own ambition, to listen to the voices we often ignore, and to build something better. The applause began slowly but grew into a standing ovation. Emily stepped back from the podium, her shoulders relaxing slightly. Ethan met her gaze, his expression a mix of admiration and something deeper. Later, as the gala wound down, Ethan and Emily found themselves on the rooftop terrace. The city stretched out before them, a sea of lights twinkling against the night sky. The noise of the crowd below felt distant, almost unreal. You handled that well, Ethan said, leaning against the railing. Emily smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I survived it. That's enough. Ethan turned to face her, his expression serious. You've done more than survive, Emily. You've made people think. You've made me think. Emily studied him, her gaze softening. What are you thinking now? He hesitated, then said, that I've spent most of my life chasing things that don't matter. Power, control, validation. And for what? For what indeed, Emily said quietly. Ethan exhaled, looking out at the city. I want to do better. I don't know how yet, but I know I can't go back to who I was. Emily tilted her head, considering him. People don't change overnight, Ethan, but they grow, and growth takes time. He nodded, her words settling over him like a challenge he was finally ready to meet. Then I'll take the time. And maybe, if I'm lucky, you'll stick around to see it. Emily smiled, her guard lowering just enough to let hope creep in. We'll see, Ethan. We'll see. The months that followed the Sentinel Publishing Gala brought a quiet transformation. The world buzzed with the lingering influence of Silent Echoes, a movement that had grown far beyond its pages. Schools and universities added the book to their curriculums. Community leaders organized discussions around its themes. It was no longer just a story. It was a catalyst. Ethan Cole found himself at the heart of this change, though not in the way he had anticipated. The man who once built an empire on ambition and dominance now used his influence to amplify voices other than his own. He shifted his company's priorities, investing in projects that supported education and community-building initiatives inspired by the book. Yet, amidst the professional evolution, Ethan's personal journey was far more profound. His interactions with Emily Harper had left an indelible mark, challenging him to confront parts of himself he had long ignored. And while their relationship remained unconventional, a delicate balance of mutual respect and occasional sparring. There was an unspoken understanding between them. One crisp autumn morning, Ethan stood in front of a small community center in Emily's town. The building was unassuming but vibrant, with colorful murals painted by local artists and a steady stream of visitors coming and going. Ethan adjusted his coat against the chill as he waited for Emily to arrive. When she appeared, carrying a tote bag filled with books, he couldn't help but smile. She was bundled in a scarf and a long coat, her hair tucked under a knit hat. She looked at ease, as if this small-town life suited her perfectly, a stark contrast to the corporate world Ethan had known. "You're early," Emily said, her tone teasing as she approached him. "I figured it'd be a good chance to observe," Ethan replied, nodding toward the building. "This place is incredible." "It is," Emily agreed, "and it's about to get better." She gestured for him to follow her inside. The community center buzzed with activity. Volunteers sorted donated books, children gathered for story time, and a group of teenagers worked on a mural in one corner. Emily led Ethan to a quiet room at the back, where a sign read Reading and Reflection Room, sponsored by Coal Industries. Ethan stopped, his gaze lingering on the sign. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice quieter. Emily looked at him, her expression soft but firm. "You did the work. You made this happen." They stepped inside, the room filled with shelves of books, cozy chairs, and soft lighting. It was a space designed for connection and introspection, a testament to the themes of Silent Echoes. Ethan felt a swell of pride and something deeper, gratitude. "I never thought I'd see my name on something like this," he admitted. Running a hand along the edge of a bookshelf, Emily smiled faintly. "People grow, Ethan. Even you." He chuckled, but her words stayed with him. Later that afternoon, as they sat on a bench outside the community center, Ethan turned to Emily. "Do you ever think about what's next? For the book, for you?" Emily leaned back, looking up at the sky. "Sometimes," she said, "but I try not to plan too far ahead. The book's done its job. Now it's about what people do with it." "And what about you?" Ethan pressed. "What do you want?" Emily hesitated, then glanced at him. "I want to keep writing, not for fame or recognition, but because it's what I love. And I want to stay here, where things feel real." Ethan nodded slowly. "And you're okay with staying out of the spotlight? Even now?" Emily smiled. "The message is what matters, Ethan, not the messenger." He studied her for a moment, then said, "You know, I used to think power was about being seen, being the loudest, the strongest. But you've shown me it's the quiet things that have the most impact." Emily looked away, her expression softening. "Sometimes, the quiet things are the only things that matter." For a while, they sat in comfortable silence, the rustle of leaves and the chatter of children filling the air. The world around them felt both expansive and intimate, a reminder of how far they had come, and how much further they could go. That evening, as Ethan drove back to Manhattan, he found himself reflecting on the past year. Silent Echoes had forced him to confront truths he had long ignored, but it was Emily who had shown him how to act on them. She had changed him in ways he hadn't thought possible, not through force, but through unwavering conviction. Back in his penthouse, Ethan stood by the window, looking out at the city lights. For the first time in years, he didn't see a battlefield or a trophy case. He saw a canvas, waiting for something meaningful to be built. He picked up his phone and sent Emily a text. "Thank you for everything." Her reply came a moment later. "Keep going, Ethan. The world needs more quiet things,